You are being recorded, so you've been told. We'll shut the recording off afterwards so you can say things that you want. I'm Stephen Bourne. I'm the president of the Rise Civic League, and we're going to do two things tonight. We're going to walk through all the warrant articles that are going to be voted on July 13th, and then candidates night is going to be July 6th. We're going to have the candidates in the Zoom in the library, and then everyone else will be remote. So I got to move my click down so I can start moving the screens. Here's all the warrant articles. I like this view. It lets you just at a glance see what they all are. We'll be sending out in the Civic News a short sheet that will help you vote on these with some yes, no's. And that will go out to everyone that gets the Civic News before the election. So those are all those. For the candidates races, there's 3 competitive races. For Select Board, we've May Bradshaw and Tom King. The Budget Committee, we have 2 people going for 1 seat. And then the Library Trustees has 4 people, actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people going for 2 seats. So those are the competitive races. We'll let the other candidates make statements at the end, but we've got to work out those details with Bob Eaton. So we're going to first go through all the planning and zoning ordinance warrant articles. These cannot be changed at the deliberative meeting. If you want to have inputs, you need to go to the planning board meetings, the rules and regs they start with in the fall. And then there's 2 public hearings for each for these before they can be placed on the warrant. So that is your only time to have any inputs on these. So we're not going to spend that much time on them, but just quickly, the first 2 around came from the demolition committee. The first one to, make it a little bit more consistent. So there's only 1 set of demolition rules that apply to different houses. They were overlapping. The second one is to give some notices. So I think you've seen those ZBA notices out in front of houses so that abutters will start to have some insights that things are going to be demolished. The next one, Amendment 3, is pretty interesting. Well, at least it was to me. Our town attorney decided that 2 areas in town around the breakers and then, which is on Odeon Point by the water that used to get smelly, and then the Saunders Point, Pilot House, Hemingway's Restaurant, he decided that, those are mostly residentials and they were zoned business and we should change that. Well, he didn't first go and talk to all the people living there to see if that was okay with them. The people that lived in the breakers community found out about it because they're all in a condominium association, were able to communicate with each other, and they ended up going to the planning board and saying, hey, we don't really want this. Can you delay this or not do it? Push it out to next year. Give us some time. Planning board said no. They had to hire a lawyer. So we're paying our town attorney to do this. They had to pay their lawyer to stop it, and made a case why they shouldn't do it. And all their arguments about why they shouldn't do it applied to this warrant article, but the planning board still went ahead and put this forward. So if you know people that live down by Saunders Point, Pilot House, anywhere in that area, you should let them know that their house is going to be rezoned from business to residential. The next one is just a definition of what pervious is. So that's letting water flow through it or not. We don't want to have a lot of ground that is, blacktop that doesn't let the water, seep in to the ground. It runs off and gets into our wetlands. The next one is on off-street parking, making the parking spaces not as wide. Cars aren't as wide anymore. 3 times is a charm. Hopefully this warrant article, the town has got it wrong twice. And it hasn't passed. They've had mistakes in the wording and everything else, and it hasn't passed. So this is to make parking spaces narrower. Wetland boundary dispute, it's the order that things get addressed. So it originally started that if you could go to the zoning board, and the zoning, if they don't see it's the hardship, not going to do anything, they sort of have to give a variance because there isn't any ordinances that say that they really need to be being overzealous about protecting the wetlands and everything else. So they give the variance. And then the planning board said, well, people go, well, I already got my zoning, variance, so you can't tell me I can't do that. So this is to change the order, make them go to the planning board first and have a soil scientist weigh in to do that. The next one, delineation of the wetlands. So vernal pools, I provided a link here because I had to Google it the first time I ever heard about it. So it's basically in a low-lying area that fills up with water that's not there by the time we get to the drought season, dries up. So it is a habitat for, kicking off for a lot of the ecosystem. And so those need to be protected just as much as, the wetlands. And so this actually just changes the, actually requires that a wetland scientist come in. Now, I'm not quite sure. I've never heard back from the planning board. When I asked, do they have to bring one in? What this says is if it was, let's say 20 years ago, it was a vernal pool, to prove it's a vernal pool, a wetland scientist has got to say within 10 years that happened. And then the next one is just really to clean up the definition and make it consistent with the states. And you have the link there if you're curious about how the state defines a vernal pool. And then the wetlands, actually that's a typo. It's the mobile homes. This one, yes, you shouldn't have things defined twice in the same document. But what I found was curious was that they kept it in the later section. They didn't put it in the earlier section. So you'd think maybe, like you do with abbreviations, you use it first and then use the abbreviation. The planning board decided not to do it that way and remove the earlier section because we have one big book of codes we approved last year. So it's one big, I can have it over there, a big thick binder like this. I could have brought it up as a prop. All right, the town budget, we're going to go into that in gory detail coming up, but that's what we're voting on. The next one, Article 10, is the TAP grant. So this was passed last year. Thought I'd put it in there. Yep, 942 to 666 last year, but it got, the state took away the money because of COVID and everything else. And this is you can see the links. It's to do some safety improvements, try to slow down traffic in the middle of town area. The big thing that this does is it's going to keep us from having to go to the warrant every year. So basically we're agreeing to this, and if we don't get the money this year, it still keeps us in the running to get the $500,000 state matching to it. By the time, if it goes out to 2025, it's probably going to be a lot more, but it's that's what this one article does. This is an old image that we put together a number of years ago. But what it's showing is the darker the blue is, the more transmissive it is. So that's porous. How, good things and bad things can flow through the ground. We're pointing out where the transfer station is, and it's sitting above the Garland Well. And also adjacent to it is the old town dump, the Grove Road landfill. So we have the dump and the old landfill on top of our best aquifer on the area of town that's the most porous. So it's something, there's only one other spot I think in town that is this porous. And I took this picture back in 2018 where the trucks are back in that corner where the salt shed's going. It's all downhill. They were those silly squares that the Safeways that they paint, they were washing out the buckets, and the blue water, you can see, just runs right down to the low part towards the aquifer wellhead protection zone. The salt shed, we approved it last year. 1077 to 527, because they split it in part, it only needed 50% of the vote, where the years past, it was a bond that needed 700,000 and you needed 3/5. If you went to business school, you took classes and you say long-term investments, you use long-term debt like bonds, short-term things, you use short-term money. This isn't doing that. The select board decided to do it this way to get it by the voters. And it did last year, and this is the rest of the money. The note down there is, I was curious about, they're taking 92,000 out of the fund, but there's another, 1,291 in it at the time. And I'm like, well, can't we just move that to the general fund and close this thing out in one fell swoop? Because remember last year, they had multiple warrant articles to do that. I did speak with the DRA. They could have, the town does, they told me they couldn't. The DRA, she told me, yes, you can have that balance moved to the general fund. I disagree with her, the DRA, because she wants a separate article to close out the fund entirely. To me, that just didn't make sense. If it's a dedicated source, this is for it. You spent all the money. Why would somebody want to spend the money and then keep the fund open? But that was her rationale. This is an old table too, showing all the fire apparatus our Rye and our neighboring town does. I did this a number of years ago. Went to all the fire stations and asked them what they had. They could have had more by now and changed. But the bottom line is we're oversaturated in our region with fire trucks. And the towns to the right are towns with approximate size populations. You can see how much more, many more pieces of equipment we have for the area. We actually need more staff. And the chief did a presentation Tuesday night that one person showed up at about saying how he wants to, right now we have 2 people on staff all the time. He wants to start increasing that because we only have 2 people. Takes 2 people to take out every vehicle, and they only can take one at a time. I think 14% of the time that they're out on a call, they get a second call. That comes from a neighboring town. So, but the chief, fire chief's got a great plan, within his span of control to maintain and come up with a game plan. He needs to be commended for the great work he's done there, planning, doing the research, presenting it, but we're oversaturated with fire equipment. And his next move is to buy a mini pumper. And it's like I said, it's a strategically around if Rye is going to continue to be a work by itself entity, he's made a good case for that. The money's going to come from the 2 of the funds, and it's to replace a 28-year-old truck. And then the picture is from our capital improvement plan that they use to provide recommendations to the select board. The next table, Warrant Article 9, is from Dennis McCarthy, the DPW chief. And really what I like about this, if you look on the right, those are the replacement years for all the vehicles. Now, he does a great job saying, how much equipment does the town have? We got about 1.3 million in fire apparatus. And what happened a number of years ago is one of the select board members said, oh, I'm going to save everyone money. I'm going to deny doing this. We're not going to spend money on a new truck this year. Well, what happened is they ended up having to buy 3 vehicles in a year. They don't have the bandwidth for that, to figure out what to buy, to go buy it, get rid of the old one, move all the equipment. They just don't have the staff to do that much vehicle switching, but they do have the manpower to do about once a year. And that's what the Dennis McCarthy, the DPW director, doing. Here's his plan. The only question I have is, can we get longer lives out of it? But, you got to keep in mind, you don't want to pile it up in 1 year because there's only, you look at this table, only 2032 is the only year that something he doesn't think should be the replacement year for vehicles. So that has to be managed. So this year he's looking to get a new front end loader. And the only thing about that is, it's only 9 years old. The CIP says the life expectancy of a front end loader is 25 years. But he's made the case to go ahead and replace that. And you can see the balance that we have in the fund. That money will come out. And once again, the picture from the CIP. We just talked about this. So every year, it's a good thing. Remember when I talked earlier about, everyone this year is using the DPW, the dump, the roads. And so it's a good thing we should pay every year. And so this is the way you balance out the cost, so the opposite depreciation, or actually the same thing as depreciation, you take out the cost the year you're using it. And so this is what he's been doing with that. And the fire does the same thing where we put in 100,000 into the capital reserve, but it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. How many vehicles do we need? The next set of warrant articles, I grouped these a little out of order, but they're accumulated leave funds. So when somebody retires, they've accumulated vacation and leave time, and it's a liability. And what the state says is we should have about half of that liability on hand, because not everyone's going to retire at the same time. And, a good rule of thumb is to do it that way. I could not get the town to get back to me with what those liability amounts are. So maybe people could ask that on Saturday at the deliberative meeting, but those are the town, the library, and the building maintenance fund is actually different, but that's so small I stuck it in there. The conservation commission is accumulating a lot of land. Goss Farm needs maintaining the other properties. They don't know when, they could have something hit instead of going back to the town and asking for money to repair or do something, they've decided to be prudent that if they had a maintenance expendable trust fund, and so this establishes that and puts an initial amount in that fund.